If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I am a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched The Holdovers so that we can study the hero's monologue. This 2023 film was directed by Alexander Payne from a screenplay by David Hemmingson. Now, of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And please help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, how did you go this week with The Holdovers?
I love this movie. All right, so I chose this movie because it's set during the Christmas holidays. And of course, Christmas is right around the corner. But what I didn't realize is that it offers a super interesting opportunity to explore the hero's monologue. To explain what I mean by that, I got to back up a little bit. I want you to cast your mind back all the way back to season 5, when I studied the shapes of stories or the forms of stories. Now, this work that I did in season 5 was entirely based on the work of Robert McKee from his book Story. As a quick recap, there are basically 4 types of stories or 4 shapes of stories. And they're based on certain criteria, like whether or not there's a clear cause and effect reality, whether there's a linear timeline, and so on. The most prominent story shape is the arc plot or classic story form. Now, a conservative estimate is that 90% of the stories that we consume today are this classic or arc plot story form. It is so common that, with the exception of McKee, theory books and theory courses, they don't even mention that there is any other form of story. And this causes problems for writers who want to write a multi-plot story or a mini-plot story, or what I mean by that is stories that are character-driven or quote-unquote literary novels. Like that type of an author runs into all kinds of headaches when they start to study story theory, because the story theory books and writing courses aren't geared to the type of story that they want to write. So character-driven stories tend to fall into what's called a mini-plot form of storytelling. Now, it's important to remember here that these 4 story types are not distinct silos. There's a sliding scale between them. Yes, absolutely, you will find stories that are very much a classic story form. You will find other stories that are very much a mini plot form. Most stories kind of fall somewhere in the middle, right? And they lean more heavily toward one or the other. That's art. This is not math we're doing here. It's art. The stories that we have studied so far this season on the podcast have all followed the classic story form. Now, that wasn't a conscious choice from me or from Melanie. I'm Melanie, I'm speaking for you, but I know that's true. It's just that this is such a popular story form that almost all of the movies being made today are the classic story form. Aha, but not all of them are. And that brings me to The Holdovers. Now, The Holdovers is a multi-plot story with 2 protagonists. Paul Hunnam, who is the teacher, and Angus Tully, who is the student. Now, although these characters are antagonistic to one another, Paul Hunnam is the primary protagonist. Because there are 2 protagonists, there are 2 intersecting storylines, one for Paul, one for Angus. Angus's storyline is a classic arc plot form. However, Paul's storyline is a mini plot form. He is mostly a passive protagonist. And this idea of a passive protagonist is kind of the hallmark of a mini plot story. So if we have two storylines, we therefore must have two heroes' monologues, okay? So Angus's hero's monologue is pretty straightforward. It's much like any of the other films that we have studied this season. It's much like most of the films that you're going to study or most of the books that you're going to study. It comes at about an hour and 46 minutes into this movie, and it's right after Angus has visited his father in the mental health facility. And I'm just going to read what Angus says. It's not too long, but it's a little bit long. Okay, so Angus says, "He used to be fine. He was better than fine. He was great. He was my dad. Then about 4 years ago, he started acting strange, erratic, forgetful. My mom took him to a bunch of doctors and they put him on medication. But that just made it worse. He got more confused. Then he got angry. And then he got physical. That was it. That was the last straw. They put him away. And she divorced him without him even realizing it. That's why she wants a whole new life. And it's easy to just stash me away in a boarding school. Like half of us are just stashed away there. And I get it. She never has to look at me because maybe when she looks at me, she sees him. Maybe she's right. I can't keep it together. I lie, I steal, I piss people off. I don't have any friends, real friends. I'll probably get kicked out of Barton too. And when I do, it'll be my own fault. Get sent to Fort Union and maybe to you know where. And nobody will care. The funny thing is, I wanted to see him so bad this whole time. But I also didn't, because I'm afraid that's what's going to happen to me one day. So why does Angus do what he does? It's because he is a heartbroken kid who just wants to see his father. It's that simple and that complex all at the same time. But that is his burning desire. That is the thing driving him to take action. He wants to see his father. All right. That brings us to Paul's monologue. And this one, for my money, is way more interesting. Now, let me just give a quick recap of what this whole hero's monologue thing is all about. So the purpose of the hero's monologue is to explain to the audience why the character is going after his object of desire. By its very nature, it assumes a classic story form, which has, by definition, a single protagonist who is in active pursuit of some goal. In other words, some object of desire. And that's Angus, right? I mean, that's what Angus is doing. He wants to see his father, and he is taking active steps toward achieving that goal. He seizes upon every single opportunity. But Paul is a passive protagonist. He does not have a clear goal that he is actively pursuing. I mean, yeah, sure, he wants things. He wants to get through the Christmas vacation as peacefully as possible. He wants to be left alone. He wants to read mystery books instead of babysitting the students. There's lots of things he wants, but none of them are objects of desire in the story sense. Instead, Paul spends the entire film, or almost the whole film, reacting to things that are done to him. Other characters, secondary characters, are active. Paul is passive, but everybody else is active. And this is essential. This is really important because if the secondary characters were also passive, there would be no plot. I mean, when I say it like that, it sounds logical, right? I mean, it's almost like, Valerie, why are you even bothering to say that? You would be surprised by how often I read quote unquote literary novels that have no plot because everybody is passive. Some of them are unpublished authors. Some of them are published authors. That whole discussion of publishing is, we'll do that another day. But suffice it to say that every story, if it's going to work, if you're going to earn any money on the book, for it to have a hope of hitting a bestseller list, you have to have two things. You have to have characters and plot. You can't just have one or the other. Let me give you an example. Miss Crane invites Paul and Angus to the Christmas party, right? Were it not for Mary and Angus prodding him, Paul would not have gone to the party. Even his refusal is passive. To him, it's understood that Miss Crane was only being polite when she invited him to the party, and she doesn't actually expect him to see him or Angus there. And so therefore, an active refusal isn't even necessary. When she invites him, he smiles and he thanks her and says, "That's very nice." And that's it. It kind of surprises him when Angus says he wants to go. And it surprises him even further when Mary has a problem with it. Because he can pass off Angus's desire to go and what he sees as Angus's misreading of the situation as Angus's naivete. He's a kid. He hasn't matured enough yet. But Mary is a grown woman. And so he assumes that Mary understands from the situation that it wasn't a real invite, that didn't need an active refusal. So even from that, Paul is passive. All right, so far so good. Everyone is with me, I'm sure. The question then is, what does this mean for the hero's monologue? If the point of the monologue is to explain why the hero is actively pursuing an object of desire, but then you have a hero who is passive and doesn't have an object of desire, what happens? Does that mean there is no monologue? Or does that mean the monologue has a different function? Well, I think it's the latter. Because, here's why I think this. Because the audience or the reader still needs to understand what makes the main character tick. Instead of asking, why is the hero active? Why is the hero going after what they're going after? Why do they want it? Now we're asking, why is the hero passive? Why isn't he going after anything? Why doesn't he have an object of desire? That is just as valid a question, just as important a question, and your reader needs to understand why the character is passive, and it needs to make sense. It has to be a really good story reason. For Paul, I think the answer comes at about an hour and 39 minutes into the film. This is when Paul and Angus have bumped into Paul's old schoolmate, who comments that he's glad Paul has landed on his feet. Now, of course, Angus wants to know what that means. So here's what Paul says. And again, this is a bit long, but it's important. Paul says, "There was an incident when I was at Harvard with my roommate. He accused me of copying from his senior thesis, plagiarizing. He stole from me, but that blue-blooded prick's family had allies on the faculty. I mean, their last name is on a library, for Christ's sake. So he accused me in order to sanitize his treachery, and they threw me out. I got kicked out of Harvard for hitting him with a car by accident. But he broke 3 ribs, which was technically his fault because he shouldn't have been in the road. Also, he shat himself, which was the greater indignity." Angus says, "So Mr. Hunnam didn't finish college? You didn't finish up somewhere else? I mean, who else knows?" Paul says, "Well, Dr. Green knew, only Dr. Green. He'd always believed in me, so he gave me a job. Adjunct faculty, 0 respect, and even less pay. So nobody batted an eye, and I've been at the school ever since." Angus, "Are you ashamed at how things turned out?" Paul, "Not at all. I'm proud of my work. I love history. I love Barton. Barton is my life. I don't know what I would do without Barton. I lied because I knew he'd relish the fact that I'm a washout and never left my own high school. And he'd probably repeat that story to everybody we used to know, so I figured he's not entitled to my story. I am." Melanie, this screenplay is so well written. Honestly, the more I watch this movie, the more I study it, the more I love it. Anyone who wants to write a character-driven story, seriously, this is a film you have to study. There is so much here to learn, and there's just so many light bulb moments. If you want to write a passive character, this is how you get them to function. You need everybody else in the story to be very active and to be pushing and prodding the character and making them move, because they are not going to move on their own. So in this little bit of dialogue, now I pulled out most of Angus's lines there for the sake of time, but it is very much a dialogue between the two of them. And it is mostly, if not all, exposition. It is brilliantly performed by Paul Giamatti. We learn everything that we need to know about Paul Hunnam. We finally understand why he is the way he is. It's not because he's embarrassed or ashamed about his eye or his body odor. We know this from the earlier conversations that he's had with Mary and Angus about both of these topics. It's because his future, his academic career, and a marriage were taken away by a spoiled rich kid who felt entitled and who came from a powerful family. When his academic career ended, he also lost the woman he loved. Earlier in the film, he told Mary that he got close to marriage once, right after college. So if you put that little bit of information together with this monologue, this hero's monologue, we understand that because his roommate, who was the guilty party, accused him of plagiarizing, he lost everything. And it's no wonder that he refused to pass this kid, Jordan Osgood, who was Senator Osgood's son and whose acceptance to Princeton was rescinded when Jordan failed out of Barton, right? This is one of the opening scenes when Paul is being given the assignment of looking after the holdovers during the holidays. So then, why is Paul a passive character? Because life has smacked him down so hard that he has retreated to a corner of safety, which is Barton. And he is terrified to stick his head above the parapet. Like he is absolutely terrified. He is afraid to hope, so much so that he has become depressed and he's become an alcoholic. We know that he rarely leaves campus. We know he spends the holidays at the school. We see at one point that he actually does begin to hope that the lovely Miss Crane might be interested in him. There might be a glimmer of hope. There might be a chance that he doesn't have to be lonely anymore. Only to have that hope dashed when we see Miss Crane's handsome boyfriend right at the Christmas party. Everything about this character of Paul Hunnam is bittersweet. He is not a bad person. We see that in the empathy that he has for Mary and in the way he softens to Angus over the course of the film. He is a man who is in pain and who therefore has never dared allow himself to dream. Mary even points this out. She says, "You can't even dream a whole dream." And all of this is why, at the end of the movie, when Paul sacrifices himself to save Angus, we cheer for him. Like it is true catharsis for the viewer. Paul Hunnam's adventure is about to begin. He finally took action right at the end of the movie, and in doing so, has created an opportunity for both characters, him and Angus, both of whom have been kicked around by life. He has created an opportunity for both of them to triumph. I love this movie. Okay, Melanie, how did you go this week with The Shadow?
Oh, well, The Shadow was really interesting this week because, again, it's another great example of The Shadow not necessarily being a bad characteristic for a character. So let's have a look. And just the character of Paul Hunnam is actually a really good place to start, right? So let's look at what we know about him. And like Valerie, I've classified him as the main protagonist in The Holdovers. He is reclusive, he is grumpy, and he's determined to give his students grief. He's given the job of looking after the holdovers at Christmas, which is a job that none of the other teachers want. and he believes he's being punished for failing one of the privileged boys whose parents donated to the school. And the students and the teachers all hate him. Now, before we go on and look at that a little bit further, I want to revisit some theory that I put out in episode 2 of this season, because it holds the key that will open the door to Paul Hunnam's shadow. Now, another way to look at the shadow is to think about what the character hides. What are they ashamed to reveal? So if we think of our characters as people, then what you see is not all there, or what you see at the surface level is not all there is to that character or that person. And this is definitely the case with Paul Hunnam. What most of the world doesn't see is Paul's kindness to Mary, the school's cook who lost her son in the Vietnam War. Now, Mary didn't have enough money to send Curtis, her son, to college, so she couldn't get him into college, nor could she get a doctor to diagnose him with bone spurs. So the privileged kids could afford a deferment, but she was not in that position. So Paul understands this, and he has a kind side, but it's not for everyone. And this is an indication of what his shadow is. It's linked to his ability to empathize with the powerless. So Paul has made himself powerful in his class. He's flexed his power when he failed the donor's son, which prevented that boy then from going to Princeton. But what's behind this, and why is this so important to Paul? Because he really does hang on to his ability to actually wield that power. Well, later in the film, it's revealed that Paul hides away in Barton because he didn't finish his degree, and Valerie just went through this. And then he went on to be accused of plagiarism and hit the kid or the boy or the man with the car. So Paul's shame is the result of not finishing college and not being able to stand up for himself because of the kid's parents' donor status. And these events cause Paul to lose any empathy for the boys he teaches. So being empathetic is his shadow. So I quoted Christopher Vogler in episode 2, and this comes from the book The Writer's Journey. And I think it's worth going over what was said again. And so what Vogler said about the shadow is, and I quote, "Shadows can express positive as well as negative aspects. The shadow in a person's psyche may be anything that has been suppressed, neglected, or forgotten. The shadow shelters the healthy, natural feelings we believe we are not supposed to show. But healthy anger or grief, if suppressed in the territory of the shadow, can turn to harmful energy that strikes out and undermines us in unexpected ways," end quote. So Paul is suppressing the kind aspects of his personality. And what's important is that we see Paul's shadow early in the film when he's talking to Mary. But what we actually see more of is his disagreeable side. Now, as I pointed out last week, the shadow isn't just negative personality traits. The shadow is all about what's being repressed. Now, Angus Tully brings Paul's shadow into the light, right? So the parts of himself that he's trying to hide or suppress. And Angus does this in 2 main ways. And at first, Angus protects Paul by lying about an injury during a hospital visit. Now, Paul doesn't have many people protecting him, especially a student. And secondly, Paul tells Angus about being kicked out of Harvard. And then once Angus knows that, then Paul's shame or his secret does not seem as big. And Angus is the lightning rod character for Paul. So our characters need the hidden aspects of their personality or their shameful secrets to come into the light. And once the shadow is in the light, then our characters can choose when and how to merge them into their lives, or merge their shadow into their lives. And what's lovely about this film is how Paul grows as a person by mirroring the same two methods that Angus used to draw out the shadow. So Paul keeps Angus's secret about his father. And what I mean by that is Angus's fear about becoming his father. And then Paul lies to protect Angus from going to military school. Paul's kindness and his empathy, which he reserved for Mary and others like her, is felt by Angus, but only seen by the audience because Angus actually doesn't know what it was that Paul did. And then after that, Paul is set free from Barton. But what I really want you to understand about the shadow in this film is that we see a glimpse of Paul's shadow, his empathy, at the start. And this is important because we saw a glimpse of Brian's shadow in Backdraft, and we also saw a glimpse of Margaret's shadow in The Proposal. So the shadow in prescriptive stories must be evident before the big climactic moment when the protagonist makes a choice whether or not to integrate the hidden part of their character and whether to acknowledge it or not. So the shadow can't appear at the last minute and be some sort of machina ex deus experience for the main character. Now, here's a bit of advanced theory application for you. The shadow is directly related to the character's dimension. And if you don't know what I mean, please go back and listen to Valerie's description of this in season 8, and in particular, episode 802, The Woman King, where she gives a really good summary of what character dimension is. But very quickly and very simply, it is conflicting character traits. So, for example, Paul demands kindness and respect for Mary, but doesn't give kindness and respect to his peers or to his students. Paul says he loves being alone, but he drinks to dull his loneliness. He lectures on historical events and people who impacted history, but he lives a very small and sheltered life himself. What's also fascinating is that the contradictions aren't balanced. The shadow lies in the smaller, less obvious aspects of the character's dimension. Now, the other two characters that have shadows in the Holdovers are Mary and Angus. So for Mary, she lost hope when her son was killed in the war, but it was the visit to her pregnant sister and the revelation that the baby will be named after her son that brings hope back to her. Now, Angus's shadow, as mentioned, is his fear that he will become like his father, and he actually feels powerless. He tells everyone that his father is dead, but this isn't true. And Paul helps Angus to come to terms with his fear, and he gives him some power back when he says, "You are not your father." Now remember that Paul empathizes with the powerless, and Angus is powerless in other ways too. His mother leaves him at boarding school, and she stops him from visiting his father. And then she also threatens to send him to military school. So Angus is at the whims of other people, or his life is at the whims of other people's wants. Now, there is more detail and nuance to Mary and Angus's shadows, but I just wanted to point out that the shadow can exist in many characters. But the main focus of my analysis this week was on Paul. So I hope that's really helpful. All right, Valerie, what is the action step for this week?
Before I get into that, I just want to pick up on something you said there. You said that the shadow can exist in many characters if you have a cast of complex, nuanced characters.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Seriously, everyone, if you have not yet watched The Holdovers, give yourself the gift of watching this film.
I think
you just feel so good at the end.
Yeah, and I think especially this Christmas, right? Because this year has been pretty difficult. And I think this, especially at Christmas time, this movie will give you a little bit of hope if you didn't have much left.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So for the action step, I want you to take a really good look at your protagonist, especially if you're writing a character-driven story, and consider how the supporting cast brings out aspects of your main character. Just as we learn about Paul Hunnam because of his interactions with Angus, Mary, and others, your reader is going to learn about your protagonists because of her interactions with the people around her.
All right, so that wraps it up for this week. Join us again after the holidays when we discuss Rebecca. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For the power to write a best-selling story, visit storynerd.ca/courses. And to join Valerie's Inner Circle, go to valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. For tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.